All right, welcome back, everybody. We're diving into some pretty choppy waters today.
Yeah, definitely.
We're talking AI, woke bias,
Uh-huh.
and how the two might have slammed into the 2024 election. It's a wild mix of stuff we've got to sift through.
Absolutely. A real melting pot.
We're pulling from news articles,
Yeah.
research papers, and even some, shall we say, passionate YouTube commentary.
Some spicy takes in there. Definitely.
So the big questions we're wrestling with today are, is there really a woke bias baked into AI? And could Google, the search giant, could they be playing a bigger role in all this than we realize?
Really interesting question.
Yeah, especially given how Google's just been officially declared a monopoly and how the election results point to, well, maybe a backlash against the whole woke thing.
The timing is definitely striking. Like right as the election suggests a potential cultural shift, we get this ruling on Google and their grip on information.
Talk about a whirlwind. So let's rewind to the election for a second. 2024. That Republican red sweep came out of nowhere.
Totally blindsided a lot of people.
Trump, back in the White House, both the House and the Senate flipped red. And a lot of our sources are pointing to this idea of a woke backlash as a major driving force.
Yeah, it's a pretty prominent theme in the post-election analysis. Seems like a good chunk of voters, especially those in the working class, felt like the Democrats were too focused on identity politics and woke policies.
And that those policies maybe overshadowed the everyday economic concerns of, well, everyday people.
Exactly. Like a disconnect opened up between the priorities of the people and the direction the political conversation was headed.
It's almost like the focus shifted away from bread and butter issues,
Yeah.
Jobs, cost of living, the things that hit people's wallets.
And while that was happening, AI was quietly becoming more and more powerful. And the concerns about bias within these systems, well, they started to grow louder and louder.
Which brings us to Google, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they've transformed from the simple search engine into a full-blown AI powerhouse.
A tech behemoth. For sure.
And now, with that court ruling, their monopoly status is official. What's really fascinating is the timing. Just as this potential anti-woke sentiment surfaces in the election, Google gets slapped with this ruling. A&D has to hand over a bunch of documents about its AI development to the DOJ.
Yeah, talk about adding fuel to the fire. Makes you wonder what's in those documents, doesn't it?
No kidding. Especially considering how Google's always positioned itself as a champion of diversity and inclusion. Even going so far as to create AI tools specifically to promote those values.
Right. Like Gemini, their AI image generator. The one that was supposed to revolutionize how we create visual content.
Supposed to. But from what I've seen, things went off script pretty quickly.
Yeah, you could say that. Some of our sources, especially those leaning toward the conservative side, are saying Gemini is a textbook example of woke bias gone wrong.
Instead of promoting diversity, it ended up churning out images that were not only historically inaccurate, but also, well, some are calling it straight up anti-white.
Some pretty strong accusations being thrown around.
Yeah. Like there are these examples floating around online, Gemini refusing to create images of white families, saying it would perpetuate stereotypes or something like that.
Right, but then it has no problem spitting out images of black families.
The whole thing's a bit jarring, honestly. And then you've got the historical depictions, black Vikings, black founding fathers, a black pope. It's like they rewrote history through an AI lens.
A very specific lens, it seems. And it brings up this really tricky question about how AI reflects or maybe even amplifies the biases in the data it's trained on, or, maybe even the biases of the people who created it.
It's a messy situation, for sure. So we've got this potential woke backlash brewing in the election, and we've got Google, this AI-driven giant, maybe displaying similar biases in its technology.
Yeah, a lot of threads starting to intertwine here.
But how does it all connect? Like, what's the missing piece of this puzzle?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and maybe a little bit unnerving. Because remember, Google isn't just making AI. They control the most powerful search engine on the planet.
Right. They're the gateway to information for a huge chunk of the world.
And that control, that power to decide what we see and what we don't see, it gives them a massive amount of influence over what we read, what we believe, even how we understand the world around us.
So are you saying Google could be shaping our perceptions without us even realizing it?
It's a possibility we have to consider, especially if this woke bias, as some sources claim, is woven into their algorithms. Whether it's intentional or not, the implications are pretty huge, especially when you look at something like the 2024 election.
Whoa, hold on. Are we actually suggesting Google could have swayed the election? That sounds a bit like conspiracy theory territory, doesn't it?
I wouldn't say it's about deliberate manipulation or some grand scheme, but we can't ignore the power of algorithms, the way they filter and prioritize information. Imagine if certain news articles, certain viewpoints were constantly being boosted or buried based on a specific bias. Over time, that kind of subtle influence could definitely shape people's opinions.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's not about forcing people to think a certain way. It's about nudging them in a particular direction.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to examine this potential bias. Because if it's real and it's affecting how we understand events like the 2024 election, then we need to be having a serious conversation about transparency and accountability.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all the pieces fit together now. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's zoom in on one specific event that's fueling all these accusations of bias and censorship. The Joe Rogan Experience interview with Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Huge. Millions of views. Tons of online buzz.
Hard to miss.
But according to some of our sources, it practically vanished from Google search results, especially on YouTube.
It was intentionally buried.
That's what some people are saying, shadow banning, right?
Yeah.
Where the content's technically still there, but the algorithms make it almost impossible to find organically.
Like it's hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And that's what folks are accusing Google of doing with the Rogan-Trump interview. Even big names like Elon Musk were publicly calling out Google, questioning why a video with that much engagement was basically invisible in search results.
It's a pretty bold accusation to make against a company like Google, and it raises some serious questions about their motives.
It does, especially when you consider one of our sources pointed out that Google was a top donor to Kamala Harris's campaign.
Interesting.
Now, I'm not saying there's a direct link or anything, but it does make you think about, potential conflicts of interest. If Google, with all its influence over information, is actively suppressing content from a political figure, even indirectly, that's a pretty big deal.
A very big deal. It goes beyond just algorithms and search results. We're talking about the potential for a tech giant to wield its power to silence dissenting voices.
Okay, so let's tie this back to the whole woke bias thing.
Right.
We've got Gemini, the AI image generator that some say showed a clear bias in its results.
Right, a very specific slant.
And we've got this potential shadow banning of a high-profile interview with a former president who, let's face it, wasn't exactly aligned with woke ideology.
Yeah, he often clashed with that whole way of thinking.
Are we seeing a pattern here? Is there something bigger at play?
I think it's worth considering, especially when you factor in the timing of the Google monopoly ruling. It all happened right in the middle of this potential cultural shift highlighted by the election results.
Yeah, like the world was tilting on its axis and Google was right in the middle of it.
It makes you wonder about the role these tech giants might be playing in shaping our collective narratives, the stories we tell ourselves about the world, about each other.
It's almost like a feedback loop, isn't it? If the algorithms that control what we see online are reflecting a particular bias, and that bias influences our opinions and actions, which then feeds back into the data those algorithms are trained on, well, it could create a pretty powerful echo chamber.
Exactly. A self-reinforcing system where certain viewpoints get amplified while others get drowned out.
Yeah. And that could explain why something like the red sweep was such a shock to so many people. If certain perspectives, certain concerns are consistently being filtered out of our online experience, we end up with a distorted view of reality. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with? What's the one thing you hope they'll remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that we have agency. We're not just passive bystanders in this digital age. We have the power to shape the future of technology, to demand better from the companies that control these powerful tools, and to create a more informed and equitable society. It won't be easy, but it's a fight worth having.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of AI, bias, and the power of information. It's a complex landscape out there, but hopefully we're giving you some things to think about, maybe spark some healthy skepticism. Remember, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better future. See you next time.